Thanks, Sanyo. Hello, everyone. Lovely to see you again, and thanks for joining. I'll just say this is a nice casual catch up. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll chat through what was a very busy few weeks in Parliament. It seems to go very quickly, and I'll be throwing to Georgia. And as Anyo mentioned as well, we've got Joanna Kay with us from the Smart Energy Council, just to have a chat to us, answer a few questions later on about the government's response to the US's Inflation Reduction Act and some of the programs that were implemented in the last budget. So very excited to hear from you, Joanna. Thank you so much for joining us. It'd be very good to hear from you. And I thought I would start, and I'm not sort of talking about anything in any particular order. It's just I've written myself a quick list. Lots and lots goes on down in Canberra, so I just thought I'd crack on and start talking about it. And please save up your questions as well. And Anyo, you're very welcome to interrupt Georgia and I if there, a question relevant to what I'm talking about comes through, and we'll try and answer it as we go along. Thank you. So I thought I would start with the voice. It was another historic moment in Parliament and for our nation, really, because last week, the Constitution Alteration Bill passed the House, and that was all about allowing for a voice to Parliament to be established if the referendum gets up. So that was incredibly exciting. There were so many speeches on that had gone on for the previous weeks, and so many people wanting to speak on it. And it really was a momentous time being in the chamber and voting for that to go through. It was quite an exciting time. So we're another step closer to the vote, to the referendum, I should say, and just sort of looking ahead to the months ahead. I think that the Yes campaign is really gearing up, and we'll be playing our part in this electorate as well. A lot of people still don't even know that there's a referendum on, so a lot of it will just be letting people know that there is a referendum and what that referendum's about. We are planning to do a mail out to everybody in the electorate with the Uluru Statement of the Heart, so people can read for themselves what this is all about, and hopefully some, resources where people can get information. And we'll be holding panels and different things in the future as well, so people can have their questions answered, because a lot of the sort of uncertainty comes just from people are not sure, one, what a referendum is sometimes, what it will mean for our constitution and what it means for our country. So allowing people to have their questions answered is a really important part of what I can do as an MP and my team can do as well. So we're looking forward to that. That's going to be keeping us very busy in the second half of the year. Georgia, have you got anything to add on that topic, and are there any questions coming through?
The only thing I'd add is how exciting it is to be in Parliament in a year where we're going to have a referendum. They come about very infrequently, and I love them. I'm excited.
And for anyone who I didn't introduce Georgia, who is my policy advisor. So for anyone that doesn't know Georgia, this is Georgia Steele, and also spotlit up the top is Peter Garrett as well, who is my Chief of Staff here in the electorate office. All right, so that's that. And then I'll talk about the Infrastructure Australia Bill, which was a really interesting piece of politics. The way that it should be done, we've been reflecting on how politics should be done in the chamber as well, because there was some really, I think, positive debate that went on about this Infrastructure Australia Bill. So the government is attempting to make some changes to Infrastructure Australia. But what the crossbench was able to do was to introduce our own amendments that would have made it even more transparent and accountable and more independent. So I, again, on the back of my Ending Jobs for Mates bill that I introduced earlier on in the year, again, introduced an amendment that would have meant that the three commissioners, so they're changing the structure of it, and now there will be three commissioners that basically have a heavy input into where Australia spends its money on these nation building projects. So my amendment was that these commissioners, who hold very powerful positions, should actually be made at arm's length in many ways from the minister. The way it stands at the moment is that the minister, it's up to the minister, it's at the minister's discretion who is actually appointed to these very powerful positions, and there's a lot of talk about how it'll be based on expertise and merit and all that type of thing. But when it comes down to it, there's still a lack of transparency about how these decisions will be made. And what I'm calling for with my amendment was that there again should be an independent selection panel, which decides out of the candidates that apply, which ones make it onto the shortlist, and then the minister is able to choose from that shortlist. And of course, the shortlist is going to be based on expertise and merit, and there has to be a proper advertising publicly of the role and the criteria that are required. So there was a really robust debate. Georgia, you can talk to this. You were sitting back and watching it all, as it all unfolded, but it was a powerful moment in parliamentary history, I think.
It really was. It was fantastic to see so many members of the crossbench, independents and Greens alike, really standing up and debating a bill requiring the minister to be in the parliament for some hours to get through all the amendments that were put there and answer what were very, very good questions, explain why very good amendments weren't going to be made. These things rattle the government a little bit, to be honest, and that's exactly what we're there to do, to keep them on their toes.
Yeah, exactly.
Brought an amendment, which was an amendment to the same bill proposed in 2014 by the Prime Minister. So that's a powerful moment when you're asking why the government's not introducing an amendment, not going to accept an amendment like that. It was a great morning in Australian politics.
And exactly, and it just sort of showcased what one of the roles of the crossbench is, and of independents are, and that is really to continue to hold the government to account and to ask questions. Why aren't you doing this? Why, you spoke about doing this. Why aren't you actually doing it? Or, so it really is a powerful role, holding the government to account, amongst other things, and bringing forward good solutions and good ideas as well. And I think the more we do it, the more robust debate we have in the House, the better. So that's the Infrastructure Australia bill that went through. I'll just talk now about HECS and HELP debts. And a lot of you may have heard in the media that with the high inflation rate that we currently have, is that the HECS and HELP debts on the 1st of June were increased by 7.1%, which is a huge amount. And this meant that a lot of young people who have these debts actually and have been paying it off all year. It means that by the end of the year, their debt will actually be more than what it was at the beginning of the year. And yes, as the government argues, it doesn't actually change the amount you need to repay, your repayment amount, I should say. It does increase the total amount. But what it does do for young people who are trying to get into the housing market and things like that is it makes it much harder for them to get a mortgage or borrow money. So it really does impact their futures in a big way. And I've received messages where there's some people who've done a master's course and something like that, and they've got $140,000 debt. And with the indexation, the high level of indexation, it'll go up, to over 150,000. So that's a huge debt. On average, it's around $25,000 that people come out of their university courses with that amount, but it's still a lot. So I made a statement in the House, a 90-second statement calling for the government to actually freeze this indexation at the moment. And another call, also another option that Zali Steggall and we wrote a letter to the minister about, was actually indexing it to either the consumer price index, which it currently is at the moment, or the wage price, whichever is lower. So that's a far more kind of fair way to do it. But a freeze on indexation was what we called for as well. And on the back of that, as I said, the crossbench, a number of us did sign a letter which was sent to the Minister for Education, Jason Clare. And on the back of that, the crossbench had a meeting with the Minister, and he was talking about how, as part of the review into higher education, the Universities Accord would also look at the issue of HECS and HELP debt and how they can make it fairer into the future. So we saw that as quite a big win. in many ways, and we were able to bring the concerns of our communities directly to the minister and have an impact on that. Georgia, have you got any comments?
Only that I was interested to see in the press Minister Clare talking about the impact on government revenue that any kind of pause on indexation would have. And it just struck me how far we've come from the era of tertiary education being free in this country to an era where we think about it as an opportunity to fill government coffers with a 7.1% indexation. And one of the points that Sophie had been making in speeches and in appeals to the minister was that HECS isn't meant to act, it's not supposed to be this. It's not supposed to be something that government can earn money from, and it's not supposed to hurt young people in the way that it currently is. So that's just another observation.
Thanks, Georgia. All right, next subject is ending native forest logging. That was something else that was quite big down in Parliament this time, because we heard the Victorian government basically bring in the fact that they were going to end native forest logging by 2024, which was a huge win. And we've got to just, I always try and make it clear that it's not ending logging, it's ending native forest logging. There's still a very flourishing plantation forestry down in Victoria as well, same as we have here in New South Wales. So Victoria has joined WA in, phasing out native forest logging very soon, and I was calling for New South Wales to do the same. And again, there was another letter written from the crossbench to the Minister for Environment about ending native forest logging. It's something that Australians all over the country feel very strongly about. We know that we're in an extinction crisis, and yet as taxpayers, we are funding the destruction of what is crucially important koala habitat. So here in New South Wales, for example, you may have heard that the state Labor government has proposed the Great Koala National Park, and that is like 175,000 hectares of native forest in the hinterland on the mid-north coast in from Coffs Harbour. But also, we also know that New South Wales Forestry Corp has earmarked about nearly 20% of that to be logged next year. So that's 30,000 hectares of what has been defined as crucially important koala habitat, and 1 out of 5 of the state's koalas are in this area. So there's this crazy, and the other thing to say is that Forestry Corp New South Wales is loss making. The native forest logging division of that corporation is actually loss making. So it does depend on taxpayer subsidies to keep it propped up. And so what that means for us is that as taxpayers, we're basically funding the destruction and the extermination of, in many ways, of koala habitat and koalas. And that's one thing, but at the same time as they're using our money to destroy koala habitat, we're also using our money to try and preserve koala habitat. So it's this crazy cycle that we're in, and the easy solution would just be to end native forest logging. The other thing to say about that as well is that even a conservative think tank, the Blueprint Institute, did some modelling on how much money the industry is actually losing, and it came up that we would save $45 million would be saved if they ended native forest logging now up in that region, as opposed to in 2040. And that $45 million in saving is despite the transition arrangements that would need to come into place to transition the industry out of native forest logging and to help the timber communities transit as well, and also to break those contracts and agreements with all the agreements that already exist for logging products from native forests. So that's quite startling in many ways. It just doesn't make sense financially, and it doesn't make sense when we're in an extinction crisis or facing climate change, because we also know that cutting down our forests releases massive amounts of carbon into our atmosphere. And I think the suggested amount from just logging 30,000 hectares in the Great Koala National Park would be equivalent to 840,000 cars off the road. Maybe it's, sorry, I think I've got that wrong, on the state, sorry, across the state. Native forest logging in New South Wales is equivalent to 840,000 cars on the roads. So it's a huge amount. So it is something that we need to take seriously. And so, as I said, we held the crossbench again. It wasn't just the crossbench. There was people from the Greens and others as well talking about native forest logging and calling for an end to that. And again, there's a lot of support for that. And I was speaking in the media about that topic again this morning on ABC radio, which was good. So we're getting more and more, we're getting our voices out there, which is good.
There's a couple of questions in the chat, Sophie. Can you hear me?
Great, thank you.
And so I don't know if you can see them, but I think David Stewart is asking if in Parliament anyone has actually sort of raised the question, why are we exporting timber?
I think there's a lot of questions. There's a lot going on because, yeah, there's a lot, because the other thing is that a lot of our native forest products are actually exported for very low value products. So wood chips, for firewood, for fence paintings, that type of thing. So it is actually quite horrific when you delve down deep into it. And I just have a look at also Murray's question.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. What we were looking at is changes to the EPBC Act. So the EPBC Act is the nation's environmental laws, so the national environmental laws. They were supposed to be debated and amended, you know, we were hoping by now already, but they haven't been. It's sort of been kicked down the road a bit further. We're now going to be debating the Nature Repair Market Bill instead. But what really needs to happen first is this debate and the amendments to our national environmental laws, because in the meantime, what we're seeing is more coal mines being passed through. And we're also seeing the native forest logging continuing. So, Murray, you're absolutely right. There is this setup currently, which has been there for a couple of decades, where state native forest logging, or the state forestry industry, is exempt from our national environmental laws. So that's why it's been able to go on for so long. And that's what many of us in Parliament, particularly on the crossbench, will be pushing for, that exemption is finished, halted, done, gone. And actually, it was really exciting because Allegra asked a question in question time about native forest logging, and for the first time we heard Minister Plibersek actually make some sort of, I wouldn't say a promise, but mentioned that they were thinking that they would definitely, sorry, I shouldn't say definitely, that they were discussing removing those regional forestry agreement carve-outs. So that was really quite exciting as well. And it's a big step ahead. And as I said, even though she just sort of mentioned it in question time, it is an indication to the industry. It's sort of a soft way to let people know this is happening, this is coming. So it was a really good sign. And we were like, wow, we didn't know that. So a lot of us have been talking about that. And that was the first indication that the government would probably go ahead with something like that to end those carve-outs. Georgia, jump in if you've got anything to add. I think that's it for the questions at the moment. Sorry, I was just reading some of the questions. Okay, good. All right. So then one of the next things that was something that we were involved in, sort of flinging from subject to subject, was Zoe Daniel introduced her private members bill to regulate gambling marketing on social media platforms and on TV and radio. So very similar to the junk food advertising bill that I'll be implementing soon. She's doing that around gambling. And it's something that people, again, across the country, I think that the support for something like this is up as high as 80 or 90% for Australians to do something about gambling advertising. And again, we had a press conference and letter written to the ministers as well. So there's a lot of pushing on that. And I feel like there's also currently a committee that's looking into gambling reform, and that will soon be handing down its report. Georgia, do you happen to know when that might come down?
Oh, don't you put me on the spot,
No,
Sophie? No, I
sorry.
don't know the
I think
date.
it's
Sorry.
I think it's on the near horizon. So that's exciting. So that's happening as well. And I guess I'll just segue from there. It was my turn last week to introduce a matter of public importance for debate. So we call it an MPI, and occasionally we get the opportunity to introduce a topic for debate in the House. And so there's usually 5 or 6 from the opposition side or the non-government side, and then there's 5 from the government side. So the topic that I introduced was the regulation of the marketing of harmful products. So it allowed us to talk about, several different harmful products, including tobacco and e-cigarettes. I spoke a lot about junk food, gambling again, alcohol, all these things. And there's a similar issue, and it is how our children are being targeted quite often, or many people being targeted with individualized marketing. And what happens on these social media and digital platforms is that people's information is mined. It is then, you get labeled with, over 1,000, a couple of thousand interest labels, and then that information is sold to companies. And so then what's happening is young people, in particular, young men and boys, are being targeted particularly with alcohol and gambling advertising. It's quite frightening, actually. And girls in particular have been targeted with junk food advertising and alcohol, but gambling is becoming more prominent for young girls as well. So the argument was, everyone was in furious agreement, really. It was really a good debate, and I think our country is in a place where we are ready to do something about regulating these harmful products. The government also introduced last week that they are doing some more reforms on tobacco as well, clamping down on that, increasing taxes with different sort of branding as well, branding on individual cigarettes, making it harder to get them. But also particularly exciting is they are doing a lot around vaping and e-cigarettes. And I can't remember if I spoke about it last time, but e-cigarettes and vaping is a real problem at the moment, because the vapes are coming into the country illegally. They're illegal, and it hasn't been very well policed at all. So a lot of illegal products will be imported, and these illegal products are not supposed to have nicotine and will often be branded as having no nicotine in them, but do contain often huge amounts of nicotine. And as we know, nicotine is one of the most addictive products known to man, and the just with, again, the marketing is all to children in bright colours, lolly flavours, sold on the corner, petrol stations and things like that, close to where kids catch the buses, and it became all the rage for young people to be vaping. So the government, I'm really pleased to say, has decided to really invest a lot of money in regulating this properly and stopping the import of these illegal products. And I think it's a really important thing to do, because we know actually that more and more young people were using vapes, and with nicotine being so highly addictive, it was actually, rather than being used to help people come off tobacco, it was actually starting to be a gateway drug for young people to actually get onto smoking cigarettes. So it just was wrong. And I'm really proud that the government's taking a hardline stance on this. Anyone got any questions? Bob Dylan, time for change. Gambling. Sorry, just reading some questions. Oh, look, that's interesting, David. Gambling is another loss-making enterprise. For every $1 of government revenue, $3 is required in social remediation. It's exactly right. Lives are destroyed. Yes. Okay, so that's good. Yeah, so it was a really positive debate in the chamber again, and I think this is the thing, rather than just trying to take the government down and criticise the government, it was a really constructive debate about what we can do to make this country a lot safer for our children and build healthy environments. So a lot of people were very excited about what we all spoke about, and so much so the Australian Public Health Association, the director, came around with gold stars. He just wanted to let everyone that had been involved in the debate know that actually they were really excited to hear parliamentarians talking in this way. So that was really nice. I'm just going to discuss one or two more things, and then I'm going to introduce our guest for tonight, who will speak to us for some time. I also wanted to mention that the question I asked in question time, I had a question last week, and the question I asked was about migration, because I was quite horrified to hear stories, news stories about the Nixon report. So Christine Nixon, who was the former Chief Commissioner of Victoria Police, she had been commissioned to do a report into our migration system, particularly because there were a lot of stories of human trafficking and sex slavery, and actually her review or her report is really damning of our migration review system as it currently stands, and it allows people to be exploited in the most horrific ways. And the reason I asked the question was because the government had promised to release that report publicly before the last budget, and it hasn't yet done so. So again, it ended up as another meeting with the minister, Claire O'Neill, the Home Affairs Minister, and it was another. There's actually a lot of work that's been going into reviewing the entire migration system, because as I spoke about before, people have been exploited in some of the most horrific ways, but also it's not serving our country as it should be, or people who are actually seeking refuge. So there's a lot, and it's incredibly complicated, and years of delay often before people get an answer. So the government is doing, by all accounts, a lot of work in trying to actually repair and build a migration system that suits our modern world as well. Yeah, so that was exciting as well, and it was just good. I mean, I think what the last couple of weeks told us is we had a lot of meetings with ministers, and I just wanted to report back to you that we do have that access. The government does have their door open. They are listening to us on issues of concern, and I do feel that they are responding as well in many ways, which is good. So I'll quickly mention a couple of roundtables that I attended. And then that will segue very nicely into me introducing our guest for the evening. So Kylie Tink from North Sydney, the Independent in North Sydney, she hosted a roundtable with a number of stakeholders on recycling of soft plastics, or the regulation of soft plastics, just to see what's happening in that space. And I think the other really interesting thing is that I did ask a question about soft plastic recycling, I think a couple of months ago now. And again, Minister Plibersek said at that time that unless something changed, because the levels of soft plastic recycling are so, hideously low, that they would regulate. And it does seem like that's going to be the case, which is good. But there's a lot going on in that space to try and get to a point where we are recycling or phasing out, soft plastics however we can. And I guess I should just, as I mentioned something, there was an international conference, a UN conference on plastic recycling, and that was held, I think, in Paris last week, trying to get agreement on how we are going to manage that plastic problem. And I think there were 145 countries that were signatory to a treaty on that. And then I will just mention as well, this is just to give a bit of a slap on the back for a lot of the crossbench who do all sorts of things as well. Zali Stegel, next door neighbour, Warringah Independent, is doing wonderful stuff again on climate. So she is pushing now for a target of 75% reduction in our carbon emissions by 2035. So she's labelled it 75 by 35. So that was introduced this week as well, and there was a roundtable just discussing why that's needed and how we'll get there and the opportunities for our country going forward with that. And she also hosted with there's a Parliamentary Friends of Climate Change, so with Bridget Archer and David Pocock as well. They hosted a roundtable, which was very exciting actually, because they had very distinguished guests. They had ambassadors, the ambassador from Germany, EU, so remind me of something else. And anyway, US. The UK, Who was it?
US.
US. Yeah, ambassador from the US, and also the High Commissioner from the UK. So yes, Carolyn Kennedy. How could I forget her? but yeah, it was really exciting to hear about what is happening in their regions and in their countries as well, what their plans are. And it was interesting to hear from the EU and Germany about how actually the Russian invasion of the Ukraine and what that meant for security, energy security, has not sort of pushed them back. They said, yes, we took a little step back, but has only made their resolve to go faster and stronger to diversify out of fossil fuels. And of course, everyone's looking at their supply chains and how they can diversify their supply chains in Australia. They're all very interested in Australia as, you know, a close partner as people try to get that, remove that sovereign risk for energy. And Germany in particular is very interested in green hydrogen from Australia. I should mention what America has done. I mean, a lot of you will know about the Inflation Reduction Act and the, you know, $500 billion or more that is going into transitioning their country to renewable energy, and what that means for Australia, and the new partnership and deals that have been established with Australia. So Australia will be considered as a domestic supplier, which is amazing for Australia. It means that some of that investment will come to our country as well. So they want to build capacity so that we're not just reliant on one or two countries for these really crucial resources. And then so that was fantastic. And I guess this is where I introduce Joanna. Joanna Kay is from the Smart Energy Council, and she can, some of you may have some questions, just talk about what was in the budget, what was in our budget that was a response to the Inflation Reduction Act. So one, we know we need to transition, we need to electrify, and electrify fast, and just have a chat about that, where we look to be with our electrification journey, what was offered, where do we need to go from here, how much, you know, what is that like, and also would love to hear from you as well about the $2 billion investment in hydrogen, green hydrogen. And that was another thing I asked a question particularly of the climate change minister about. What was that money to be invested for? Was it just any old hydrogen, or was it green hydrogen? And he made that commitment that it was actually for green hydrogen. So that was good to have that clarification as well. So Joanna, I would love to hear from you, both your thoughts on one, our electrification journey, where we need to go, what this investment means for us, and then also about our what it means for Australia having this investment in green hydrogen.
Fantastic. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me here this evening. It's been really, really interesting to hear your parliamentary update. So thank you for having me for that. Before I begin, I just want to recognise the traditional owners of the land that I come from. So I'm based in South Australia, and that's the Kaurna people. So I recognise the current elders, the traditional owners of this land, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. So thank you. What I might do is actually start with the Hydrogen Head Start $2 billion budget announcement. And I thank you very much, Member for McCullough, for asking that question, and the clarification for Minister Bowen on the floor to ensure that it is renewable hydrogen that this $2 billion is going for. So let me start by just taking it back a few steps. So the Inflation Reduction Act that you mentioned earlier is really about kind of growing the global response to the climate action. And so what we've seen globally are significant responses. So Canada responded straight away to the Inflation Reduction Act. In the European Commission, they created the Green Deal Industrial Plan. India put in place a $174 billion rupee incentive, which is about 3.2 billion Australian dollars. And then there's also significant responses from Korea and Japan as well, particularly around hydrogen. So the Head Start program is for renewable hydrogen. It's for around 2 to 3 large-scale renewable hydrogen projects, which I think is really important for Australia in regards to where we are in our hydrogen journey. And I can take a few steps back further as we proceed, because it is all interlinked and it gets very complicated to explain. But this is a fund that will be administered by ARENA. And it looks like it will bring the cost of renewable hydrogen down in Australia to about $2 per kilo. So at the moment, we sit between $3 to $6 per kilo. And in comparison, the Inflation Reduction Act is looking at being able to incentivise renewable hydrogen production at about $3 per kilo. So it really places us in a really good position because of a lot of other factors that kind of come into it. The other thing that I really want to mention is the compact that was signed about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Now, this is linked in here as well. This is a climate and critical minerals clean energy transformation compact. And this was signed on the sidelines of the 7 Summit in Japan. Now, this is really important because what it does is it ensures, and you mentioned that it looks at Australian companies being identified as domestic suppliers, but what it does is it creates a bilateral agreement that critical minerals from Australia will be used in the United States for their energy transition. And all of this money that's been invested, the $547 billion that's been invested in the Inflation Reduction Act, will be using our critical minerals, of which Australia has an abundance of. We have the whole spectrum needed for the clean energy transition. So we're really creating very key strategic partnerships with the US on around how we can grow our economy and make sure that we are committed to that, that transition as well. So now I'm going to go back to what the budget looked like for hydrogen and what hydrogen is kind of focused on. I'm getting a bit of back feed. Is anyone else getting a bit of a background feed?
You're muted now, but I'm hearing you clearly, Joanna.
Okay, perfect. So if I could just talk a little bit about hydrogen and what it really looks like, I think that's really kind of a good place to start, because I know hydrogen can be a super polarizing topic, and it seems to be a little bit confusing. So let me start by saying there's multiple colors of hydrogen that are produced, and it's really important that we're only focused on green hydrogen. So we've got grey hydrogen, which is produced by fossil fuels, blue hydrogen, again, produced by fossil fuels, but we're capturing the carbon that's used to create that hydrogen. We've got pink hydrogen that's used, is created by nuclear energy. And then we have green hydrogen or renewable hydrogen that is used, is created using renewable energy through an electrolyzer process. Now that is really, it's super simple. Water goes into an electrolysis and you're splitting hydrogen and a water atom. So,
can I pop in and you might answer this as we go forward with the electrification as well. We've got one question here that just talks about how green hydrogen is fantastic, maybe with renewables, all of that, but actually, are we diverting a lot of our renewable electricity away from other, where it should be used otherwise, into creating green hydrogen? Is that something that we need to be concerned about?
That's a really good question, and I think this is a great one, and thank you for asking, because it gives me an opportunity to really explain why green hydrogen is kind of fundamental to our response to climate action. So we want to electrify everything, and we should electrify absolutely everything that we possibly can. But there's certain sectors of the industry that we can't electrify, and that's heavy industry. And if you think about the processes to, blast furnaces to for iron ore to make green steel, if you look at some of the heavy fuels used in aviation, in shipping, or even long-range transport. And if you look at the ammonia production, so we can make green ammonia using green hydrogen, ammonia being one of the key ingredients to fertilizer. So we have this kind of nexus between energy security and making sure that we're creating fertilizers that are green. So absolutely, we should be electrifying everything, but there is a significant portion of our industry that can't be electrified, and that's where our focus is for renewable hydrogen. I think the other part of it is that renewable hydrogen is an opportunity for the Australian economy. So we know that we currently have a lot of reliance on heavy fossil fuel exports, coal and whatnot. The countries that we're exporting to also have these emission targets and are looking at ways to decrease their own emissions. So if we can actually facilitate clean energy trading with our key trading partners, particularly countries like Korea, Japan, India, Germany, as you mentioned, we're actually supporting Australia's future economy. So we are creating a strong economy, and one that can continue to grow as we decarbonise as well. So it's kind of twofold with hydrogen. It's about let's hit those really heavy industries and make them being able to decarbonise, but let's also really ensure we have jobs for Australia's future, and we also have opportunities to increase our economic development. Yeah. So I'll keep going on about some of the other kind of things about hydrogen, and that was a kind of really good segue into some of the other projects that were announced in the budget. So there was a $38.5 million guarantee of origin scheme that was supported, and that's really important because we don't want any greenwashing in hydrogen. So we want to make sure that all the hydrogen we're producing in Australia and renewable energy projects more broadly are actually supporting, and created by renewable energy. So that's a key one. There's also a $5.6 million study that is for the response for the Inflation Reduction Act more broadly. Okay, so what we're going to see over the next 12 months is industry coming together, and that's one of our roles at Smart Energy Council, is to coordinate kind of the industry response to the Inflation Reduction Act and work with government and help you be able to create what is the additional steps that we need to position Australia as kind of a first mover in this space as well. If I could talk a little bit about a couple of the other things that were announced, there was $300 million for home electrification, and I saw one pop up. I didn't read the whole message, but I saw Sol Griffiths' name, so a good shout out to Rewiring Australia and the work that they're doing. One of my colleagues gave me a stat yesterday, which I should mention because I feel like this is incredibly important and goes to some of the things that you were talking about, health benefits in the community. In Victoria, there was a decade-long study around the health benefits for electrifying homes. So if you think about making sure they're insulated, they have electric heat pumps, and just really improving the living conditions of community housing, they saw an $800 per year per person deduction in healthcare costs for each of those people, which is, you imagine 2 people over the age of 65 living in community housing that has gone through that process. That's a $1,600 a year per household saving for government funds around public healthcare. So an incredible statistic that I think is really important when we're thinking about this as well. And I know Georgia wanted me to mention some of the community battery work as well. So I think that's really important. We know that we need 20 gigawatts of renewable energy storage to allow us to transition and make our 2030 goals. And we know that 10 gigawatts of that will come from large-scale renewable energy storage, and 10 of the second half will come from household storage. It will come from community battery storage. It will come from batteries on wheels, so electric vehicles, and it will come from industry storage as well. And what we say at Smart Energy Council when it comes to storage is everything, everywhere, all the time, over and over and over again. And I think that's what we really need to focus on. And we want to make sure that the government is really supporting this program. We know that ARENA has put out the EOI for these community batteries in April, and they will, I think it's mid or early next year, we'll be able to complete that process for that kind of community engagement. But we want to make sure that the process and the tender process is really competitive, and that it is going to, a competitive process and not necessarily just going to the big power networks as well. So all in all, there were some really great wins in the budget for climate, and there were a couple that perhaps needed a little bit more tweaking. From my side, I'm definitely really impressed by the government's response thus far to the Inflation Reduction Act when it comes to hydrogen. I think we have what some could argue is an unfair advantage when it comes to renewable hydrogen. We have an abundance of renewable energy sources, which makes up about 60 to 70% of the cost to produce renewable hydrogen. So we know we can produce it at scale and at in a cost-effective way. We're also geographically positioned to be able to be a key exporter and energy trader for the region as well, particularly for countries where they have a high demand but low, perhaps, footprint of space to be able to produce renewable hydrogen.
So if you're on mute,
yes,
there's a couple of questions in the chat. Would you like to ask them?
Joanna, thank you. That's amazing. I was going to say, so it seems like when it comes to electrification, we've kicked off. We've started. We've got the Rewiring the Nation, 20 billion into that, and then there was a couple of programs where we, like the 1.3 billion home efficiency and the what else was it? Yeah, the home efficiency as well, and also some of that for, was it electrification for businesses as well? Gosh, it's probably only a month ago.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
What do we need to do? I mean, it seems like that's just a start. I think in the chat there's a bit of concern that if we're that we need to do more on electrification. Absolutely. What's your feeling on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, some of the great work that Saul Griffiths and Rewiring Australia has done is really focused on private households and electrifying them. But I think there's a huge part of the community that is actually not privately owned households. So we think about community homes, we think about renters, and I think, I saw a statistic that about 30% of people are renting, 30% have mortgages, and 30% of people own their own home. So it's 1/3 of the population that are renting at the moment. And you think about what we can do to actually support renters, because we know that there's a rental crisis. We know that the cost of living is incredibly high. So what can we do to be able to support renters and be able to electrify their homes? And that looks something a little bit like perhaps putting pressure on landlords, legislating that they have to have energy ratings on rental property advertisements, and making sure that, so when people are going to rent, they know what the star rating is of the property, and they know therefore what their kind of costs and to be able to heat and cool that property as well. And I think the other big one is community housing. I think we need to do a lot better as a society more broadly about community housing, particularly in remote areas, and areas that are perhaps affected more by kind of the effects of climate change in these regions, and the mental health issues that kind of go along with that as well. That figure of $1,600 per household for 2 people over 65 is not a small amount when you think about it at scale, and there is definitely work that we can do there.
Thank you. Exactly. As we sort of move forward into this whole electrification, currently it's sort of an unequal thing. People who've got solar on their roofs are the ones that can afford it, and then we get the lower price in energy as well. So the government's supporting those social housing to electrify and to do efficiencies as well is really amazing. There's concern. I'm just looking at the chat. There's concern. One person says is that. And I'd just love to hear your comment on this, is green hydrogen only serves to retard our transition away from fossil fuels, and it's being pushed by the fossil fuel industry.
I think my first comment is I wish it was fueled by the fossil fuel industry. They are definitely probably incredibly resistant to green hydrogen. So what we see at the moment in the hydrogen space is there is a lot of greenwashing. So you see, the fossil fuel industry talking about this transition using blue hydrogen, which is fossil fuel hydrogen, but they carbon capture, and therefore they are kind of part and part of the process. Look, from my perspective, we are very much advocating against these heavy fossil fuel industries. We're definitely working with them to transition, but it's certainly not the case that this is driven from their side at all.
Can I also add another question from the chat that came up a bit earlier? I think you might know something about this, that somebody had attended, Tim, had attended a Smart Energy Council event. There have been some questions about why we don't make solar panels here in Australia, and he'd seen that there was actually an Australian company, so you may know more about what's happening with Australian business in terms of making solar panels here.
Absolutely. So I can see I've opened the chat box now and I see SunDrive Solar, so absolutely fantastic. And just by way of background, my previous role was actually the Australian Government Specialist Advisor to the International Solar Alliance. So solar is something that I do know a little bit about. And SunDrive Solar is a really a fantastic example of Australia research and development, but also opportunity for manufacturing here. So a little bit about SunDrive. It was started out of the University of New South Wales, so a New South Wales, Sydney startup, and they've replaced the silver in the solar panels with copper, and it brings I think it's 26.4% efficiency rating, which is about 2% more than other solar panels. So if you think about manufacturing at scale and what that can look like, it's fantastic. So the challenges, I think, around manufacturing solar in Australia at the moment is possibly the Inflation Reduction Act. There's a lot of incentive now for Australian solar manufacturing to go offshore, which is disappointing. But we're working really, really hard with industry on ensuring that the National Manufacturing Fund, all of those things are working very, very hard to keep solar manufacturing here in Australia. We've also got 5B, which is, the world's, is an incredible company. They have projects all through India, South America. They have this fantastic solar facility, product that basically concertinas up and can be deployed at scale and at speed. So, Tinder Solar also produces solar panels here in Australia. We do have a lot of opportunities here in Australia to produce our own solar panels. But I'll give a statistic here: 80% of, close to 90% of the world's solar panels are produced in one country at the moment. And there's certainly economies around the world that are working very hard to diversify that.
And I think, thank you. I think the National Reconstruction Fund was a sort of a bit of a kickoff to try and, regrow manufacturing in this country. But of course, very hard to compete with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. But I think And I've got another question here I'd love to ask you that's in the chat, and it's about bidirectional charging for with EVs. It says, why aren't we following South Australia's lead and agreeing the standards and promoting bidirectional charging for EVs to boost that storage capacity? And I guess, yeah,
that's
that's
a really good question. And as someone who's sitting here in South Australia, I have a big grin on my face when you say that. I think, you know, we are, particularly Smart Energy Council, is working really, really hard on some of this, you know, electric transport, electric mobility projects. And we've got a long way to go. So we know that, you know, the fuel efficiency standards, we've just responded to that in government. We're the only country apart from Russia that doesn't have fuel efficiency standards, which is incredible, and not in a good way. So you're absolutely right. We should be using electric vehicles for, you know, as batteries on wheels. And I think that's a good way to go forward. It's definitely something that we're advocating for.
What's holding us back with that? And the other thing is, why, I mean, you might not have the answers to this, sorry, but it's just interesting to discuss.
Okay.
Why is there why are we holding back on this bidirectional flow charging? And also, I wonder why, do you know why Australia is one of the worst in the world when it comes to fuel efficiency standards? Why are we left in that position?
Yeah, I think it's probably a byproduct of the perhaps lack of action by the previous government over the last decade, as we've seen the scale of electric vehicles kind of take place and that market grow. I don't have the answer for you as to why we don't have that, the process of battery charging, but what I will do is I'll get our EV lead to get back to you so you can provide that at your next update, because I'm definitely not a technical specialist in this regard. But yeah, I think it's diabolical that we don't have that. And I think, you know, if I look at countries, you know, I've spent a decade in China and the last 3 years in India, and he just recently returned back to Australia. The scale of electric vehicle production is huge, and it's actually a bottom-up approach. Whereas in Australia, you know, we've got those high-end kind of Teslas, and they're starting to filter down. So electric vehicles at the moment really aren't accessible to the majority of the population, and we need to change that. And that's part of the fuel efficiency standards, and making sure that we're importing electric vehicles and we're putting pressure on these car manufacturers to give electric vehicles to Australians.
Yeah, great. I'll keep pushing for that. Thank you so much, Joanna. It's great to have you along to explain those things. And I'll just, so good to hear from you. And I'll just hand back to Anya, who will finish off. But thank you, everyone, for joining. Yes, it was a busy few weeks. Over to you, Anya.